Good day and welcome to another special edition of the Offside Musings Podcast. My name is Oke Ndibe, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of my co-host Emeka Onyagwa. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at a recent BBC documentary called The Bandit Warlords of Zamfara. This documentary is eye-opening, it's disheartening, it's highly informative, and is the kind of documentary that Nigerians ought to watch because it speaks to the present condition of our country. It's an instruction as to the depth of crisis in which Nigeria is mired. So, without much ado, I'd like to welcome you and hang on, and I'll bring in my co-host and we'll begin. He and I have watched this documentary, and we simply think that more and more Nigerians need to see it. The last time I checked, it had been watched by about 1.5 million, less than 1.5 million people. And I think that this documentary deserves wide circulation because it's quite instructive about the current tragedy in progress that is Nigeria. You're welcome. You remember, we've actually mentioned this documentary by the BBC a few times glancingly in previous podcasts. And ultimately, we decided, after you had seen the documentary, the BBC documentary, I actually took time to watch it twice. And we thought that the documentary raises important questions about the condition in Nigeria. The documentary, of course, focuses on Zamfara state. It's extremely well done. It has graphic images about violence, but it's also eye-opening in so many different ways. And for me, the central thing is how it undermines and deconstructs sort of the conventional narrative in Nigeria that there is a kind of symbiotic relationship between the Hausa and the Fulani in Nigeria. What we find in the documentary, which, by the way, was narrated by a really impressive young man. His name is Yusuf. He identifies himself as a law student in Nigeria. I don't know which university he attends. But he's an interesting character because his mother is Fulani and his father is Hausa. And so he brings a depth of knowledge of the two cultures and a particular insight into the doing of this, into the narration and production of this documentary. I do know that when the documentary first came out, the Nigerian government was pretty upset and made some, I think the Nigerian Information Minister, Lai Mohammed, made some open threats against the BBC. I think actually the Nigerian government was thinking of imposing some kind of restriction, punitive measures against the BBC, but in the end they pulled. They must have figured out that if they moved against the BBC, it was going to make the documentary even more widely known and watched around the world. But having watched it, Emeka, you and I agreed that Nigerians needed to see, that more Nigerians needed to see this documentary. So I'd like you to begin by talking to me about sharing with our viewers your impressions when you first saw this documentary, The Bandit Warlords of Zamfara.
Yeah, I think it was it's a very well done piece. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Start from there. The piece is very, very well done. In my opinion, I think it's a good piece of work. It starts from one of the biggest highlights. So for those who don't know, we all know Nigeria, and people tend to lump Nigeria all in one. Especially overseas, you meet one Nigerian that does something, and it's all Nigerians. Whether you had a bad relationship with the Nigerian or whatever. But Nigeria is a very diverse country. I think that should be obvious even to matter your intellect. But the key thing here is not just a country of 371 languages counted by the linguists. Some are still pending verification. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about dying languages. I'm talking about distinct or sub-languages, like you have Okwanis and whichever place you go to, whether you go to like Adeboye, for instance, with the Igbos, you have a lot of this thing. You go check it out. Sub-Igbo word languages and all these kind of things. Talking of distinct languages. But the key thing here about this documentary, if we're going to get into this, is you have a north and you have a south. Typically, people in the south tend to look at people in the north as all northerners. So once you you take up a map of Nigeria, you go past even Ogun or all these places. What you end up having is people even classifying like Kwara, people classifying everything north of Nsukka. So Benue, people classify Benue, TVs, Idomas. They just take everybody and just lump them into a basket. And for those who might be a little bit more adventurous, you might be like, okay, these guys are kind of different. But then they lump the key part of the documentary showing something. They lump the Hausa Fulanis all into one basket and just call them northerners. And that's a key theme in this documentary. I've heard people talk about why you're giving bandits a chance to talk. These are criminals and da-da-da-da-da. I think those are people who want to discard the intellectual aspect of what they were saying in that documentary. And one of the key things you'd see even the bandits saying is that they themselves felt marginalized. They felt Fulanis don't get any position. It's not my words. This is what some of the key interviewees within the documentary saying, and these people by and large represent the dissatisfied factions of people, Fulani people who have taken up arms. They fell under attack by the Nigerian state, and there's more than enough incentive to show that if you go into the makings of Boko Haram, I think a fantastic book is Mike Smith talking about it and how it was ignited. How you chronicle both that one and Religiosity by Toyi Falola. It's another good one chronicling the exploitation and the explosion of both the exploitation of people through religion, but more or less the explosion of religion as a haven from the economic downfall of Nigeria, the obvious economic downfall from the 60s, actually, from independence. Go chronicle it. You're talking about looking at the Sheikh Gumi's father, actually. Sheikh Gumi is still a prominent cleric. But before I get to that, just to get back to the Hausa Fulani dynamic. So when you look at the Hausa Fulani dynamic, it go back to the Hausa states. We get conquered by Danfodio in the early 1800s, and they install Fulani leaders in these places. And the Fulanis within Nigeria, for the most part, don't trace their lineage to Nigeria, as best we know. So a lot of them, you go back even farther in history, trace their lineage to Tuaregs and all that. So you'd have people who were part of the Almond Caliphate in Northern Africa, not necessarily even part of the Ghana Empire or the Songari Empire, not necessarily part of some of them, trace that, say that they are from those remnants of those empires. But a lot of them trace their distance as far back as even the, what do you call it, the Mudia Empire, the first empire that sprung up after the death of the prophets that encompassed Northern Africa. So you have the what's called the Berber tribes and so on and so forth. Not to get too technical about it, but large, by and distant, they become entrenched in Nigeria, in these areas, in these communities in the 1800s. And you see that tension between the larger, and they swallowed up what was the 7 Hausa states and all that. But the Hausas are way more in number than the Fulanis. Even with the continuous influx of water, they are way more in number. And this documentary shows the continuous clash that has existed, even before Danfodio continued. Danfodio, you'd see the Fulanis feel like they don't have places to get their cattle, which, it might sound mundane to a lot of people, but for a pastoral, nomadic ethnic group, it's a big deal for them. They feel the Hausas have all to say, and the Hausas feel, by and large, like, one, they're under attack. Two, these people attacking them don't have origins in these places. And they seem to, if you point to the top of the power structure in most of these states currently, it's not the Hausas that rule. But the Fulanis themselves don't see those rulers as representing them. So it's this very, I know it's a little bit distant, but it's this very convoluted dynamic that we, see playing itself out in the narration by these key people representing different factions, talking about really, by and large, representing different groups. So that's a key thing to start with for me in this documentary. It shows that you need to uncouple this Iowa or Northern or whatever it is. You need to uncouple that mindset and then take a look at some of the things that are happening there. And when you take a look at it, everybody on the ground feels 100% disenfranchised, whether you feel they belong there or not. So
absolutely. I think that you've done an excellent job of unpacking some of the critical issues that are raised by this documentary. That's why I say that this is eye-opening. And that's why I think that more and more Nigerians would benefit from watching this, because it situates the Nigeria's political and socioeconomic drama within a clearer context than most Nigerians are able to otherwise sort of articulate. So I have made the case always, that Nigeria doesn't work for Nigerians, broadly speaking. So I have some friends who are Igbo, Yoruba, from different minority ethnic groups, who would from time to time say to me, the Hausa Fulani have everything and we have nothing. That's why we need to leave the Nigerian nation and its, tragic compulsions. And my response would always be that when you say that the Hausa Fulani have everything, that you're looking at a very tiny selection of people who happen to be ethnically Hausa, ethnically Fulani, who have access to Nigeria's resources. But I said, but if you look at it also, you see that there are Igbo, people who have access. There are people Ijaw, people who have access. There are Yoruba who have access. But Nigeria has not worked for decades for the vast majority of Nigerians, including Hausa people, including Fulani people. And that is one of the more dramatic things that come out of this documentary, because you see the bandit warlords, the Fulani warlords of the title of this documentary, speaking with passion and making the point that they are oppressed within Nigeria, that they are marginalized, that they are basically that they are discriminated against. So it goes against the grain of the narrative that we often get in our country. And so there are attacks on the Hausa community. So, so they posit within this documentary the fact that, of course, the Fulani are pastoral, cattle rearing, nomadic people, and the Hausa are sort of more, the Hausa are farmers, essentially. And so part of the conflict, which is not necessarily articulated with clarity in the documentary, is that we're seeing a certain ecological aspect to the whole crisis, right? So desertification is a critical factor. The Sahara Desert has been making big incursions from the north, and so farmland or the land available for these cattle rearers to lead their cattle and have the cattle feed is becoming less and less available. And so over the years, they have begun to destroy farmlands, because their cattle will go through farmlands and just decimate everything. And so you find the Hausa farmers, of course, begin to resist all of this, and then the Fulani's response is to use AK-47s and other really sophisticated weapons to attack Hausa communities and to just pillage and to rape and to burn. And then on their own part, the Hausa began to raise village vigilante groups that then go into the forest and often find the hiding places for these Fulani herdsmen, and then would visit their own violence on them. So that narrative of mutual savaging is it's very, very intriguing, especially because of this perception in the broader Nigerian political ecosystem, which holds that the Hausa Fulani, in a sense, are a homogeneous unit.
It holds that they're more like one,
precisely,
one unit, which has never been the case. The 7 Hausa states that were submerged, that were taken over by the by Usman Danfodio jihad, are all being led by Fulanis, blue-blooded now, which is a very interesting dynamic. There are so many dynamics at play when you think about it. But there are Quranic dynamics at play, because Danfodio had led his jihad against the Hausas because he felt they were not Islamic enough, and then he goes in, and then they end up instituting a hereditary monarchy, which is the biggest. If you go back right from the Umayyad back in 1640, the first revolts that end up happening in North Africa was always based on this conversation that Islam shouldn't, Islam doesn't have hereditary, the same kind of conversations you have against those who hate what you now have in places like Arabia, where you have a heritage, which is essentially that battle between Saudi Arabia and part of that battle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where the Iranians don't not just that they see Shia and Sunni, but there's also that hereditary thing. But now you have a hereditary caliphate in Nigeria,
in much of northern Nigeria,
Nigeria,
with the exception of the Kanuri sort of areas, because the Kanuri really were never defeated by Uthman Danfodio. Now, one other area of the documentary that I'd like us to look in is how the BBC, through Yusuf, this law student who narrates the documentary, was able to reach critical players in this conflict. And so a couple of months ago or more, this Fulani bandit who was turbaned by an emir, and of course the emir was, I think, suspended ultimately by the governor. But in this documentary, this bandit is interviewed, and he's asked a question, why do you kidnap people? And his response was that he did not kidnap anybody, that he was a killer, that he killed people. And Yusuf then asked him, how many people have you killed? And he said, basically, I can't count the number of people I've killed. He says he's killed a bunch of Hausa vigilante, and that he could not, that basically he's killed an uncountable number of people. So what's strange for me, part of what's strange about this is, as we noted at the time, when I believe his name is Alero or something, or that's a name he's known by, that on the occasion when the emir turbaned him, that this self-confessed murderer, who said, by the way, that his followers, the people that he commands were the ones doing the kidnapping, but that he himself just kills people, right? So I don't know whether he felt that to kill was a more civilized thing to do than his followers who would kidnap. Yeah. But it's interesting that there is actually a bounty on his head issued by the Nigerian law enforcement, and that this guy would be turbaned by an emir in Zamfara state. It was an event that was advertised publicly and apparently attended by hundreds, if not thousands of people. And the same police that said they are looking for him could not go there and effect the man's arrest. It's just it's interesting. And of course, there's also another bandit leader who was interviewed, who talked about their abduction of 280 schoolgirls. I think it's Jengebe school, that were in school in Jengebe. And so 280 schoolgirls were taken as they slept and taken into the forest where they were held in captivity until negotiation. So anyway, I wanted to hear your response to that aspect of that documentary.
Yeah. So you'd also have to look at the if you'd have to go back to and take a look at a good critical point is to understand how what we know today as what today is the flavor of the flavor of that word Boko Haram. But there are a whole bunch of. I mean, Boko Haram is even you got ISWAP. There are, Boko Haram is by the way. Even in that documentary, they talked about the bandits had was it 30 camps that they mentioned spread all out in different places just within Zamfara, one Zamfara state alone. And we know this thing spreads into different places. But if you go back and take a look at how Boko Haram became radicalized, I always talk about the Meticenes, which was just another expression of economic dissatisfaction with the ruling elite. This is from the 60s, 50s, 60s, religious unrest. You'd see the gradual progression from where at that point in time, Major Akilu, who ends up heading the DSS, by the way, but that's another story for another day, goes in to crush these protests and all these things in Kano, walks into the house, and it was really bloody. That, in a way, radicalized some of them, but radicalized them to just live on their own. They mostly live on their own, go from place to place. They essentially are trying to get this nomadic village where they could just stay on their own. Everybody should be left alone. Bottom line is, along the line, you had politicians that came in and decided to entice them to become warriors for them with the promise that they would give them their religious vicinity, right? They brought them into the government, specifically Ali Modu Sharif, and what they call him was also part of it. Tinubu's vice presidential nominee, Kasim Shettima, was also part of that crew. So they bring them in. At the point in time, Mohammed Yusuf that gets executed by his uncle and this thing. They were all, even he himself, they all had official roles in the government. In fact, at the point in time, his uncle, I believe, was a commissioner for in the state government but this was in Boronu, by the way, not even in Zamfara. The thing there is, the key thing about bringing up them being radicalized and then chased and then killed, which they talked about in the documentary, the Nigerian state is chasing them and killing them and all that. That was it. After they were used them and giving them weapons, they now didn't want to associate with them and they decided to go after them. And one of the big things that happened in Borno, opposite states, yes, was the killing of Mohammed Yusuf. But not just Yusuf, a whole bunch of them were killed. When you take a look at that, this thing, you understand that the politicians use them not just to be thugs, but the fact they use them in the sense that they had the trust of the people. They had and they still do have a large trust of the people, the majority of which, if not all of which, are certain classes of Fulani people, right? You would understand that looking for them is the same way you could think of it in modern distant America going into Iraq or Afghanistan and looking for some of these guys, whether it's Osama bin Laden, Zawahiri, or you go to Iraq, you're looking for Muqtada or Sada, or, a whole bunch of names, blasts from the past in some ways. You have people who can be in plain sight. Even if you're talking of America, for instance, and Britain or whichever countries, they could be in plain sight. But as far as they stay within their friendly confines, you're not going to find them. Now, the big thing there is not that they are within friendly confines, is who is within this circle of friends. And clearly, this friendly circle includes government officials, because from the get-go, they are the ones that always play the yo-yo with them. Mm-hmm. They've played the yo-yo, they radicalize them, give them money. And now with the explosion of conflicts with Northern Africa again, you're talking of Libya, you're talking of parts of Sudan, you're talking of the caches that have come in from Syria, from both the government caches and the weapons that America has brought in. There is a thriving arms sales. There's a thriving arms sales corridor that is around that place, and all these guys now are all they're all about is getting money, going to the corridor, getting these weapons that used to belong to these governments, and in a lot of cases, the weapons that America and co puts in there, and using these weapons to act as the protectors of this. And you see it in documentary where they talk about if one Fulani is killed or anything happens to one Fulani, we're going to kill 100. And you see the ladies that they born to at one point in time talking about, these people are never going to forgive. The Fulani ladies who had nothing to do with, they seem to have nothing to do with any of this. Let's take it that they had nothing to do with it. They were part of just retribution.
Yes.
And even they themselves are like saying these guys will never forgive. So it's
absolutely. So just as you mentioned, I have a few clips of what this guy who took part in the abduction of the 280 schoolgirls said. He says that terrorism is the right punishment for the government. So these are people who feel disaffected from the Nigerian state and who feel that it was important to respond to the government that they see as violent with violence of their own. So he said that the abduction of the girls is tied to terrorism, and that terrorism is the right punishment for the government, not for the people that they are holding, which you would imagine that from the point of view of the girls who were abducted and of their families, this was punishment. The terrorism was directed at them, but these terrorists felt that they were directing the violence of their terrorism at the government. So, and he says the right way to teach them, the government, that they are wrong. And then he said he felt no guilt at all for what he did. And he says, all we know is we inflicted disgrace on the government. We inflicted disgrace on the government. It's interesting because throughout the documentary, you get a clash between government narrative and the memory of the community, which I trust far more. So there's this Hausa community that was attacked. And the elders of that community took the BBC to the grounds where the victims of that attack were buried. And they said that the government had issued a statement saying that 50-something people were killed, I think 58. But the community said that more than 200 were killed. And they pointed to mass graves. They said 15 people were buried in this grave and 20 in that grave. And so they pointed to different graves. So this is a familiar story in Nigeria where needless violence is inflicted on Nigerians. People die needlessly, and the government comes out, maybe a certain number of people die. And the government of Nigeria always has this attitude that if 200 people die and we say that only 58 died, that somehow it reduces the gravity of the government's failure to protect lives and property. So for me, if 58 Nigerians died who should not have died, even if one Nigerian dies who should not have died, it's already an indictment on the incompetence and the disaster, and that is the government. That is because the government's mission, any government worth its salt, its minimum mission is to protect the lives and property of its citizens. But then this guy who abducted, whose group abducted 280 girls, also undermined the government's account in another area. So the governments in Nigeria, both the federal government as well as state governments, would often say that victims of abductions were released by their kidnappers without the payment of ransom. And here is this warlord, bandit warlord, saying that initially they had demanded 300 million from the government of Zamfara to release the 280 girls. That in the end they settled on 60 million. And so Yusuf said to him, "You saw 60 million naira?" And the guy said, "Yes." And the next question was, "What did you use the money for?" And he said, "We went and bought more arms, more weapons." And he in fact said, "Oh, if we had time, I could go and get some of those weapons so that you'll see." So that what's the picture here is that terrorism in Nigeria then becomes self-reproducing because the terrorists use the weapons they have to commit violence against Nigerians, including the violence of kidnaps and of abductions. The government or private, there's a situation where a woman was speaking about being abducted from their families and they had to sell their farmlands and so on to meet the 3 million naira that the abductors had asked for. And they had left their home thereafter and they were now staying as refugees in a settlement in a different community. So you find a situation where law enforcement has failed in Zamfara state, in much of the Northeast, indeed throughout Nigeria. People are abducted on highways. The abductors then get money in terms of ransom. They go and buy more weapons, so they're able to inflict greater violence and greater acts of terror on more and more a widening circle of victims. So it's interesting on so many level. And this guy, the bandit whose group abducted the Jengebe schoolgirls, says in the interview that kidnapping, it has become a business. So we bought weapons. So guns and so on become weapons for the carrying out of this business. And it's the Nigerian state we want to emphasize. It's the Nigerian state that has produced the social conditions for criminality to thrive in Nigeria. And it's the Nigerian state that is ultimately failing to play its role, its legitimate role as an enforcer of laws. And once the state abdicates its responsibility to protect citizens from unwarranted attacks, then what happens is, again, in the documentary, this is a trope that comes up again and again. So citizens then take to self-help. They go look for their own guns, they protect themselves, and in protecting themselves, they ultimately inflict violence, even on innocent people.
Yeah, it's true. It's now in a self-sustaining venture that still has an ideological bent. People who believe that they're being marginalized. Mm-hmm. It's funny. The rest of Nigeria looks. By the way,
I mean, there is a point where people talked about, this is tribal. One of the Fulani leaders said, yes, it's tribal. He says the Fulani attack innocent people. Then the Hausa and their reprisals attack innocent Fulani. And he said, all the crime that you commit to merit attack is simply to belong to an ethnic group. So if it is Fulani who have set out to do the attacks, they are targeting Hausa people. But also there are moments in the documentary where the Fulani would also attack fellow Fulani and vice versa.
Yeah. It's a self-sustaining cycle. There are people who, as far as they're concerned, the narrative for them is that they are highly marginalized and highly disrespected. Then the rest of Nigeria will talk about how the Fulanis are in power, whether it's in the north, in parts like that, in other parts where you have other ethnic groups where they are creating emirates and creating emirs, right? But to them, the people don't represent them, don't care for them. One of his quotes is that if there are 10 positions, if the position opens up, that they'll take 20 Hausa people before they even consider one Fulani person.
And yet the impression out there, so this is the impression of a Fulani in the documentary, right? And yet the impression that, I know that a lot of my Igbo friends will tell you that every position goes to the Hausa Fulani, so that sort of conflation of the two Hausa Fulani it's so accepted within Nigeria, so that for a lot of Nigerians it's going to come as a shock to see the war going on between the two groups that Nigerians would usually bring together under one bracket.
Yeah, well, we bring it together under one bracket because of collective ignorance, which is largely due to the failure of the educational system, taken out of history in schools. So, no matter how you explain it to people, you're still going to have large swaths of people who don't even. You're talking about people that, from the South, you look at the Nupes, other larger ethnic groups, the Gwaris, so many groups you could call. A lot of them are even actually Christians. They were also never subjugated by the Danfodio jihads. Large amount of, I feel like a lot of those states, like you see, go to Bauchi, for instance. I lived there for a little bit with my dad. I felt like the majority of the indigenous I'd seen there were Christians. And you see it in state creation. They created local governments and states to pack all the Christians away from political power. So you go like the Azare local governments, all those places, they were all just packed with, and then they would spread out the other distance. So, it's a very tricky dynamic. It's a very tricky dynamic, to say the least. And now you have a whole bunch of people who feel they are being marginalized, and the Fulanis, even though the president is the Fulani father and Hausa mother, and he more or less represents more of the Fulani people, they don't feel represents them. Same thing with the Zamfara governors; they're always Fulani people, right? They don't feel to represent them. So it's a whole bunch of people who feel they are victims and who are going to the extremes to make their points heard and expressed. And the key points in it, when we talk about education, is you'd see even with them, they are talking about, you'd see there was a repentant Fulani band, the guy.
Yeah, who had given up his guns and all.
Who had given up his weapons. And he was talking about it like a lot of these, how are they getting recruits? Well, a lot of these places have been attacked, a lot of this. There's an almost complete absence of education in these areas.
Yeah.
So a lot of these people don't know anything, and all they know is that they need to die on the battlefield.
Yeah.
They need to be martyred on the battlefield. So it's an absolute it's a very destructive cycle.
Yeah, and let's talk about talking about that. So the absence of education, which comes up again and again. So this again, the bandit leader whose group abducted the girls. One of the things he says in the documentary is that everyone wants money. That's why things are deteriorating from the top to the bottom. So this is a critique, an interesting critique, again, of the Nigerian system. Everyone wants money. And that is why things are deteriorating from the top to the bottom. And this is borne out by the situation in Nigeria, where the ostensible leaders of the country basically loot the treasury. That's the job that they excel in, is to loot the treasury. And once people see that going into government is the quickest route to self-enrichment, and of course that this self-enrichment is at the expense of the generality of the people under a specific public officer's control, then everything is up for grabs. Every citizen then feels that they can use whatever means that's available to them to essentially make their own money, which everybody, as this bandit says, everybody needs money, everybody wants money. But to pivot back to education, for me, one of the most painful moments in the documentary has to do with the schoolgirls who were abducted. You remember on the day of their release, after the government had apparently paid a ransom of 60 million, shameless politicians gathered the parents who had come to take back their girls who'd just been released. But these shameless politicians just began to basically, as it were, bask in this false glory, as if they had achieved sort of a heroic act of governance in getting these young girls released. So they were reading speeches, introducing honorable speaker, so and so, the honorable commissioner should come and speak. And as they were making these mindless speeches, the parents and the community that had come to retrieve their daughters, who had just been rescued from captivity, not rescued, but released by the abductors, began to grow restive, And so they began to demonstrate, because they said the roads that they would take their daughters just released through to get home were often rigged with Fulani bandits. So they said night was falling. And so they began to complain. And suddenly the politicians themselves recognized that things were getting out of hand, and they got in their vehicles, and as they were zooming away, the soldiers in their midst, the soldiers who were guarding them, began to shoot indiscriminately. And the poor young boy, I think 5 years old, who had come to welcome his sister, was killed. To hear his father speak about the tragedies, it talks about, my son got up a little bit and looked into my eyes and then died. it just is heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching. But it's the kind of tragedy that Nigeria visits on its citizens. And that's why ultimately I tell people that Nigeria works for maybe 1%, the people who are really at the top of, at the helm of affairs at different levels of governance. Those are the people who are stealing the resources of the country. That is very, very painful. The other painful moment is when one of the girls who was rescued spoke about the pressures on her and on the other girls to go get married. But she said no, that she wants to get an education. Unfortunately, after their release, their school was shut down. Principally because the government has no answer. The government has no way of securing the safety of these girls or of their communities.
Yeah, that I mean, I was at the end of the documentary, the father, coming there to. As a matter of fact, this guy is the fact the way at least the way when I watched the way it played out was these guys all came in. Everybody wanted their moment of fame and all that, and they sat down and they got to 6 p.m. And they all, especially the government, all realized like, oh, we all have to get home because we can't be on the roads late. And they all started trying to rush out of the place. And these were the guys that, one, are in charge of keeping the ball largely, keeping this place safe.
That tells you
they
something,
don't do it.
Doesn't it?
Exactly. And then they come there and then in this self-aggrandizement of whatever level they sit down and have all these irrelevant speeches to the point of endangering everybody's lives there again. And they start running home, and in running home, in dispersing the crowd that is also now panicked and trying to run away, they end up killing this kid. I was touching to see the father just talk about it. It was touching.
As a father myself, I came close to tears when you watch it because I put myself in the position of this man. If you say to your son, let's go and meet your sister who's just been released, and then you get a daughter, one child back, but then the other child's life is sacrificed by the government, by the same government whose incompetence allowed the situation where your daughter was abducted to start with.
And the key thing is, I don't know, you missed that part where he talked about how the reaction from the government, for the governor and the government officials. I mean, to paraphrase it, you should go watch it yourself if you haven't watched it, but to paraphrase it, it felt like a certain level of condescension.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But who are you and who is this your son, by the way?
Yeah, So there's an absolute indifference. A man is facing the most tragic event, perhaps, of his life. But the government that caused that tragedy. That he has no recourse. This man has no recourse. It's not like he could go to court, sue the government. Basically, he's on his own, to his own with his grief. The government
he could sue the government, but
who is gonna, how is he gonna find the resources to pay a lawyer? And if you pay the lawyer, if you pay precisely, the case stays in court for years. The government has all the money, even if the case ends and the judge awards you money. First of all, when you lose your child, no amount of money is enough compensation, right? The life of a child is priceless. But even if the government were asked by a judge to pay you a certain amount of money, You will never get that money. Nobody collects a judgment in Nigeria. I have a friend who sued the government, has a judgment of 50 million. He has no recourse. No recourse. So it's only if you have a friend within the government who decides to pay you. Otherwise, there's no way to ensure that you collect on a judgment that has gone against the government. The Nigerian state is lawless. That's the sum of it. The Nigerian state is lawless. And so in a lot of ways, the lawlessness of the bandits in the documentary. So there is one more quote that I want to get from one of the bandit leaders. He says, they say when there is insecurity, the government gets money. Okay? Everyone is benefiting. We also get money. So he's talking about the government getting money from insecurity, and he's saying that they themselves also get money. He said, though for our money, blood is spilled. So people are spilling the blood of their fellows. People are spilling the blood of fellow Nigerians. Most of their victims innocent, because the government has created a situation where citizens are desperate. There's nothing going, because a visionary Nigerian state should resolve the question of herdsmen. We don't have to have nomadic herdsmen in Nigeria. A government that is visionary should institute education for the impoverished. I mean, when you look at the students, I was looking at a teacher teaching the students things like noun and verbs and so on and so forth. And these are students who should not, at their level, still be learning the definition of noun and examples of noun and verbs. These are, teenage students. So they should have known this like 5 or so years ago. So already you get a sense that the lives of the students, they've been betrayed. This is a case of betrayal, actually.
Yeah. It's crazy. You talked about the girls talking about getting married and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, you might say societal, but in another way, it's just law of numbers, the way people get killed there and the way things happen. It's just like, look, man, we can't take chances, just go. People I don't believe in investing in. And it's not just girls. A lot of the boys are out either doing banditry or doing vigilantism. And are poorly or almost entirely not educated. In fact, for those who don't know, that's the whole premise of what became the name Boko Haram. That's Boko means no. Not Haram means Western. Haram. Boko means Western. Haram means no.
Boko is actually a corruption of book.
Yeah, exactly.
So book representing Western education, a synergy for Western education, and then Haram means forbidden. Forbidden.
So that's the people think it's something that we heard about bring back our girls. No. It's a frustration from, again, the 50s, go back, the evolution of people like popularly Sheikh Gumi of today, his father. You go back, you see the evolution, you see the distant, a lot of them felt their leaders, a lot of them did 1 or 2 courses or went to university and are now un-Islamic, or rather they were not good leaders, good people. They didn't feel their impact. There's a massive, not just an ethnic divide, but there's a massive class divide as well when you go into it. And it's very clear. It's very clear in these societies. Massive. It's unlike the South where you have a lot more people, for better or worse, we could say entrepreneurial, a lot more hustling and gritty. It's not to say everybody's different, I'm not saying everywhere in the South is actually, people out there wanting to find something some way or leave the country or something. I think I lived in the North. There's somewhere I enjoyed staying. I used to, back in the day, enjoy staying in northern parts, whether it was Bauchi, Gombe, Kaduna, Abuja. I don't count as the North, but you could have also, there's more of a community and there's more open this thing. There's more of an acceptance of fate, which in their cases is not always a good thing, because when they react, when a lot of these communities react, this is what you have. So I've seen a lot of these things happen from Jos. I stayed in Bauchi. I used to go to Jos like on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. The Jos riots, the bomb, the whole situation in Jos is also similar to this. The bedrooms and these things have a problem with the Fulanis there, and it ended up largely for decades out. I think it's still going on, the Jos riots and the massacres and the murders and so on and so forth. But the point is, you have a whole generation of people who turned away from education because they saw all these guys get these so-called Western education, and they felt that they were even worse. And now we've gone on for 50, 60 years. Well, we've gone on for like 40, 50 years rather, and we are seeing an even uglier version of what was there before. This is way uglier, way more violent. And the cycle is continuing, because just like you're saying, you're having people teenagers practicing what they now is.
Yeah.
So you can imagine if there's a continuous distance to produce these kind of people who feel disenfranchised, who do not get educated, who,
therefore cannot, have no future, have very few opportunities. And it's important, to emphasize, as we sort of round up and so on, that the tragedy. So this BBC documentary gives us sort of a vignette of the Nigerian tragedy, located in a particular place. That, as the documentary says, more than 1 million people have been displaced in this area covered by the documentary. But every space in Nigeria participates in this experience of tragedy and of dysfunction, okay, to a greater or lesser degree. So it's a matter of degree, right? But Nigeria as a whole is a tragedy in progress. People who travel from, say, Lagos to Kwara, or Lagos to Onitsha, or from Onitsha to Port Harcourt, Onitsha to Owerri, Onitsha to Enugu. There is hardly now any guarantees that you can ply Nigerian roads and be certain that you're going to get to your destination. The roads are bad, so you face the prospects of accidents. But more than the roads, there is just the fact that a lot of kidnappers have staked out positions along different highways in Nigeria to take people. I mean, there is a kind of meme that I saw recently where it says the price of flights in Nigeria have risen to 150,000 naira or something. And he said the cost of traveling by road 10 to 30 million. Of course, talking about kidnappings. If you are kidnapped, this is the kind of ransom that would be demanded. So we have a country that is incredibly broken. No answers by the government. We've done documentaries, we've done episodes in the past where we pointed to the fact that Aso Rock itself, the very foundation, the very hub of governance, where the president lives and his top officials live, has been breached by armed robbers. Okay, the president's convoy has been shot at in his home state of Katsina, where they were going to prepare for the president's visit. And the Nigerian Security Advisor, NSA, did acknowledge that a bunch of them were killed. A bunch of the president's security people were killed. So if anybody is doubting how bad a shape the country is, I think that this documentary will offer you a much needed vignette into one area of the country. So again, when we talk about elections, I don't even know how you hold elections in a state like Zamfara. How do you hold elections in all the areas that you see, the burnings, the absolute terror that people live under? Okay. And then you have an entire class of young men and women who are denied basic education. How are they going to, even if they chose to forgo violence, what are the options available to them to lead their lives? I want to quote from this again. Emeka, you spoke about this Fulani guy who said that he had given up his weapons at some point, but after some attacks on his community, he said he went and got guns again. And he's the one who talked about that an Hausa person kills an innocent Fulani and that an innocent Fulani kills an innocent Hausa. I mean, a Fulani kills an innocent Hausa. And he says, I didn't pick up arms again to hurt anyone. I bought guns again to protect myself. He's bought guns again because the Nigerian government, the Nigerian security apparatus, has abdicated its responsibility to protect him and to protect other Nigerians in his space. And the most powerful and haunting conclusion to the documentary was actually uttered by the same guy. And it simply says, the end of the story is injustice. So meaning that at its core, when you distill the tragedy of what's going on in Zamfara, that it is rooted in injustice. And therefore the solution is justice. And it's justice that will start by a recognition at the highest levels of governance in Nigeria that we have failed Nigerians, and that a small, tiny minority of the country's leadership has not only failed to provide basic leadership, but has indeed acted in ways that have ruined both the present as well as imperiled the future of Nigeria. Emeka, I don't know if you have any closing words.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it's a deep, long, continuous situation that obviously, if you don't solve something, it just gets, well, if you don't tackle something or face something, it's bound to get worse. It's gotten worse. It keeps getting worse.
Yeah.
The future doesn't hold much in terms of what's going to happen because, I mean, place is broken. And all people talk about is just having this singular union of everybody should just pay power over everything. And it doesn't look likely that will be the case. But little instances like this, they're not little, but when you zoom in to different areas like this and you see just how broken it is, you realize just how much needs to be done in terms of restructuring, in terms of putting things in order, or beginning to that process. So I would say Nigeria needs that restructuring. It doesn't need to break up. Might need to break up if it does. But it needs a certain level of restructuring. It needs a certain level of some serious surgical, political repair from political angle. So if not, if you go back and take a look at it, like I said, read that book, The Origins of Boko Haram, you realize just how anybody wanting you to believe that this started in the last 10, 15 years is not being genuine about it. So, but yes, it's stuff that we would keep shining a light on, and hopefully, more people see how serious these things are, and people are able to go out there and support, and where people are able to produce these kind of high quality materials.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I really, really cannot emphasize enough how important it is for people to see this extraordinary documentary. You'll be instructed, informed, you'll be provoked, you'll be touched. And hopefully, out of all of this, you're going to make a resolution to become part of a movement, a conversation to change the trajectory of Nigeria's history. Whatever that means to you. But it cannot be an indifferent process. It's something that should compel you to think about the state of Nigeria as it is today, and where do we go from here, and how do you become part of the answer rather than part of the problem. In the end of the story is injustice. Justice should become the beginning of the next chapter of the story. Thank you very much for joining us on this special edition of our podcast, and we look forward to welcoming you again soon. Have a brilliant week.
Yep.